Hello and welcome to the Power Tools for Coalition webinar series. I'm Kinkini Banerjee, the Senior Manager of Coalition Relations at USBC, and I'm so glad to have you join us for this session. As you know, this Power Tools series is organized as part of USBC's training, technical assistance, and capacity building support for the network of state, territorial, tribal, and community breastfeeding coalitions across the US. All of these webinars are free and access is open to all interested breastfeeding coalition leaders, members, breastfeeding advocates, and anyone involved in forming or leading nonprofit organizations in the breastfeeding field. Webinar announcements are sent through the USBC's coalition announcement list. So, details and registration about the webinar, as well as slides and handouts of this webinar and recordings of past sessions, can be found on the Power Tools webpage. So you can go to www.usbreastfeeding.org/powertools, and we also post all the session details in the Coalition Learning Connection as well. So the good news is that in the past we'd had to register for each individual webinar, but now we have a series update. So if once you are registered, you automatically get reminders for all the webinars. You get announcements, timely announcements, and reminders as well. So we know that you are busy during the day and might not be able to attend every session live. But once you're registered, it sends you the reminders, and you can also go and visit the archives and listen to the recordings at your convenience. So again, all our webinar materials are on the Power Tools page. And if you go to our website at www.usbreastfeeding.org, you'll see that the last tab is the one for coalitions. Click on that, and it'll just, on the drop-down menu, it'll open up all the different webinars we have, the bi-monthly, the Power Tools, the Collective Impact, Racial Equity. So click on the Power Tool webinar, and it'll take you to this session. So you will find the PDF slides of this session already posted. So go to that page if you want to take notes, and you'll be able to download the PDF version of the slides. We have a lot of attendees on this call, so everyone is in listen-only mode. However, we encourage you to submit questions and to ask questions. This is a very important session for coalitions, an exciting one about how you can be involved in the many topic constellations that USBC is convening. So usually we have about 20 minutes for Q&A at the end of the session, but for today we will pause for questions at the end of each segment that our presenter has, so that we can do questions at a timely way. So do submit your questions during as the presentation is happening, and here's how you do it. On the right side of your screen, you should see a control panel, and if you don't see it, it may be minimized. Just click on the orange tab and it'll pop back out, and scroll down to that blue tab just below the audio section, and it's a tab that says questions. Click on the questions tab and it'll open a text box for you to type in. During today's session, if you have any tech issues, audio problems, please send an email to coalitions@usbreastfeeding.org, and our staff will be able to help you. And that brings me to today's topic, USBC Constellations, Engagement for Coalitions. We've had a previous webinar on our strategic framework, and you can see that the USBC strategic framework and structural model articulates a pathway for organizations to come together in action-focused work teams called Constellation. So for the past 2 years, we've been having stakeholder meetings called Incubation Sessions, and these have surfaced opportunities for national collaborative action on 14 different topics. So during today's webinar, you'll get an update on the current status and stage of each of these 14 constellation topics, and you'll especially learn where some of the topics have prioritized learning and action at the state level. So the webinar will discuss pathways for coalitions to engage in this work, and whether the national constellation or in state, what kind of communities that will support your involvement on the topics of your interest. So with that, I am delighted to introduce a member of the USBC team as today's presenter. Amelia Smythe is the Deputy Director of USBC, and she comes to us with a rich background in grassroots work. She began her career as a breastfeeding peer counselor and then became the Executive Director of the Nursing Mothers Council of Oregon. And she was then became the director of the Breastfeeding Coalition of Oregon, where she led efforts to implement landmark rest breaks for breast milk expression law and coordinated a number of statewide initiatives, from maternity care practices to reimbursement, on a bunch of different maternal and child health projects. She is a steward for the Lactation Support Providers Constellation, and we are so thrilled to have Amelia talk to you today about how coalitions can engage with Constellation. So I'm going to turn it over to Amelia.
Fabulous. Hello, Kinkini, and hello, everyone. Can you now see our lovely strategic framework?
We do, Amelia.
Okay, wonderful. So as you may already be able to tell, we're going to all work together around the little tickle that I have in my throat. So I will mute if that gets too much in the way, but hopefully we will be fine. So hopefully you all are familiar with the picture that you're seeing in front of you. This is USBC's strategic framework. Goal 1, to be the national collective voice for breastfeeding. This is the goal that really talks about what it is that we do and has a very broad framework that's connected to the Surgeon General's call to action. Goal 2 relates to ensuring our organizational vitality. Goal 3 is around engaging stakeholders in a collective impact model. And for me, the beauty of Goal 3 is that it talks about how we do the work. And as coalitions, we know sometimes the value add that we provide out of the fact of our existence can be a little bit hard to describe, including to funders. And so I think a lovely piece about this strategic framework is that it brings some of that into some very nice and clear language. Then goal 4 is to create and model a culture of inclusion, diversity, and equity. And the 3 objectives under this goal all relate to the previous 3 goals. And then, of course, you see this ring of equity holding it all. We like to say that we use both an equity mirror, where we're looking at our structure and our culture, and an equity lens to the work that as we look out in the world and how we frame up what we do. Let's see. So hopefully this next part is also a bit of a review. We've been telling you for a little while about the Constellation model. This is one way of organizing many different stakeholders together and bringing them together to have them define what it is that's important to do together, that none of them could do alone, but by coming together, they would really be able to work on big systems change. So here's a very wordy slide, but the major things to know about the Constellation model is that this is a system, a framework for social change that is designed to hold collaborations and to allow them to be dynamic and complex. So the 3 major elements are lightweight governance, meaning just enough agreements to be functional; action-focused work teams, meaning organizing the right partners at the right time around the right activities; and third-party coordination. So this is really key about this model, is identifying a steward or lead organization that will hold the group's intentions. So USBC will only lead and serve as the Constellation steward if there's an area where there's a particular niche or need for a neutral convener, and where we also have a funded capacity to serve as the steward around a given piece of collaborative work. So right now, USBC is poised to serve as the steward for 3 different topics: workplace support, lactation support providers, and infant sleep practices. Now, as Kinkini mentioned, we have been convening constellations on 14 different topics, which has meant that we've needed to recruit volunteer facilitators, interim stewards, and stewards to hold the other 11 topics for us. However, we serve as a backbone for the field, so we support all of the constellations as they form. Some of the services that we provide in the role of the backbone include the website and the online community workspaces, meeting time and space, consultant training and coaching, advocacy for and mobilization of funding, and communications with the field and to the general public. So I wanted to take a moment. I know for many of you that would be a review, but if there's anyone have any questions or comments just even about that beginning approach or design?
So far, Amelia, we have no questions, so I think we can continue.
Great. I think one thing I would really underscore as we move forward, the key difference between a task force or committee type structure and the constellation structure is that with a task force or committee, people come and sit at that table generally as individuals, following their own passion and their volunteer heart. Where with constellations, people are coming as representatives of their organization. So the intention is that when a constellation table is formed, everyone that's there also has these other resources that they can bring to bear, whether it's staff capacity from their organization or communication means or even funding for the larger body of work. So that's a really key distinction, individual versus organizational lift. Okay, so looking across these 14 different topics, I think first I will say I would not recommend to any coalition that you attempt to launch 14 different topics all at the same time. It has been challenging, but also gratifying, and by doing it that way, although it's taken some time to figure out what we were doing, it did give us 14 different laboratories to play with this model and figure out a little bit about how this works. So at this moment, the constellations are spread out across different developmental stages. So we have one topic that had a head start and funding, and they are in stage 4 and are a USBC affiliated constellation. Then we have 7 of the 14 topics that have identified their priority strategies and their steward or lead organization. Those are constellations in stages 2 and 3. They are emerging and organizing constellations. Then of the remaining 6 topics, they are currently receiving support from volunteer facilitators and from USBC staff to convene what we call incubation conversations, where they come together and they're still sorting through a process to identify where they have collective capacity, momentum, will, interest to do something that's big and bold enough that it needs all of them to come together. So of those 6, 4 of them are in the incubation conversation stage, and they're very close to advancing and articulating their priority strategies. And then when they do that, they'll advance to be an emerging constellation. I'll show you a chart that will help with this in a moment. And the other 2 have determined that they want to remain as learning communities for now, which is lovely. So here's the chart. Hopefully you have seen this before also. So again, when we're talking about pathway stage 4 constellations, we're looking at those that have attained several of the indicators on our pathway, Constellation Formation Pathway chart. And as I mentioned, at this point we have one constellation that where this applies. It's the Lactation Support Provider constellation. On these slides, the places where you see the red asterisk at the top, we're going to talk about those in particular are topics where we've identified that a state level strategy is going to be key in order to move the work forward. So we'll talk more about that in a moment. So for the LSP Constellation, I am serving as the steward for USBC, and our priority strategies are as follows. Number one, to expand training and mentoring opportunities for lactation care providers, particularly to increase the number of racial and ethnic minority care providers. Strategy two, excuse me, to incorporate breastfeeding support into existing public health programs. And strategy three, to expand the network of providers allowed to provide lactation care under Medicaid. So a couple fun facts here. There are significant implications of the HHS FAQ about how to implement the Affordable Care Act lactation benefits that was released at the end of October. And the good news is that the things that HHS told us about what they would like to see for lactation support in our nation aligns very well with the LSP Constellation's ultimate vision, which is to recognize the value that all providers bring and to increase access to care for all mothers. So please stay tuned for details. We're in the process of designing a full-day pre-conference workshop that will occur in advance of our national conference this summer, so that we can begin to support state-level strategies related to this body of work that this constellation of organizations has been working on for the last couple of years. Out of that pre-conference workshop, we will have a community of practice, an online community of practice that interested states will be able to come together and continue to receive technical assistance support and coalition building support to move these strategies forward. So the next topic, stage of development we talked about, where we have the bulk of our constellations currently, are emerging and organizing constellations. So these are topics that have completed some of the indicators, such as surfacing landscape updates, talking with one another about what is happening in the field. They have engagement of a good mix of initial stakeholders. So there's some thoughtfulness behind who's at the table and who is not, and who needs to come in order to have a thoughtful, full conversation. They have engaged in incubation sessions that surfaced high-level levers for change, meaning things that, again, would really benefit from having collaborative action. They've prioritized their strategies, and they've engaged in a root cause analysis, looking at the role that racial inequities has played within this topic, or some of the barriers that still need to be identified and worked through in order to move these topics forward. And then, as I said, identification of a lead organization to serve as the steward for the topic. So when we look at our Constellation Formation Pathway chart, we see, again, that these are constellations that have some of the indicators, more in this stage of the chart. So let's look at these. So first up is the community-based organizations, and the steward for this is Health Connect 1. This group, the fun fact for this group is that they were considering remaining a learning community, but their meeting in April was a very exciting one, and there was tremendous energy and will and focus to move forward and to formalize as a constellation to move forward their identified priority strategies. So this includes strategy 1, to expand the opportunities for families to share stories and voice their needs for community-based support. And strategy 2, to expand the opportunities for community-based organizations to receive cultural sensitivity training and mentoring. Next, we have formula marketing. This is a constellation that is giving us a model of how to have co-stewards. So the first strategy is to publish guidelines for healthcare and community-based organizations for relationships with the private sector. That strategy is being stewarded by the organization called WISE. Strategy 2 is to host an online community of practice for states working to ban the bags. That strategy is being led by Public Citizen. And their third strategy is to develop a consumer-focused truth in marketing campaign. And that strategy does not have a steward yet. So it is a strategy in search of a steward. but it's still an important strategy that they have identified. They've also identified that in order to move this forward, they're really going to need to have some funding so they can keep this on their plate of their agenda and their intention as they seek funding together. So a fun fact here is that USBC's position statement on formula marketing is up for revision this year, and the discussion of those recommendations about how to change and update the position statement informed the selection of strategies for this group. And as our red asterisk indicates, this strategy identified that they too want to form a state community of practice. So the origin story for that community of practice is going to has come from the Constellation table. The people within, the organizations within the formula marketing constellation said, we recognize we're going to need to involve coalitions in order to move this forward. So that's a little bit different than, remember a moment ago we talked about the LSP constellation, Lactation Support Provider Constellation. That is going to come out of the pre-conference workshop and the body of work that's been funded and supported by CDC. So they're going to come from slightly different places, but coalitions are going to have the opportunity to come into that and work together within the community of practice. Okay, next is infant sleep practices. Here again, you can see that there are co-stewards. So strategy 1 is to prepare recommendations for future research on the intersection of infant sleep and feeding practices. And ABI is serving as the steward for that strategy. And strategy 2 is to explore establishing a national cadre of infant death investigators. And strategy 3 is to pilot the cross-training of healthcare providers in both sleep and feeding practices. And those two strategies are being stewarded by USBC, and Megan Renner on our staff is leading that. So the fun fact here is that USBC's work is being supported through an engagement with the National Action Partnership to Promote Safe Sleep, known as NAPS. And this, again, is a strategy that we can see is planning to add an online community of practice for states starting in the fall. Next, we have maternity care practices. The steward of this topic is a CGBI, and the priority strategies are first to advocate for quality measures related to maternity practices, and second, to host an online community of practice for states working on related state-level initiatives. So the fun fact here is that this is, they specifically identified a strategy to form a community of practice building on the current NCATS, the National Collaborative for Advancing the 10 Steps that CGBI already hosts. So next we have the nurse education and training topic. We have co-stewards here of A1 and APHA leading a priority strategy to improve continuing lactation education opportunities for home health nurses, public health nurses, and school-based nurses. So I think this is another interesting example where we have two different organizations that are going to work together to lead one strategy. The Constellation at this time does have other incubation ideas that they're still considering. This includes conducting a gap analysis of the current nurse lactation trainings to build the case for adding academic electives and continuing education opportunities, and also to map the exam and accreditation decision makers and advocate for inclusion of breastfeeding questions in all exams. So one of the things that I think is an interesting story about this particular constellation is that, they had these two ideas for quite a while, and in the process of USBC expanding our membership opportunities so that every organization could have 4 reps instead of 2, and the request that the representatives that come be more representational of the equity and diversity in our country, we had a new member who came from APHA to the Nurse Education and Training Group and made the suggestion of working on touching these home health nurses and her peers, his or her peers. And the idea was stated, but it was in the process of doing the root cause analysis, where we really looked at all the different ideas under consideration through an equity lens, that this idea rose to the top. And I think that's one of many good examples of how we have worked to embed into this process an equity lens and an equity mirror, both in terms of who is there and then in what kind of process they deliberately go through before declaring what their priority strategies are. The other fun fact I wanted to lift up about this particular group is that the maternity care constellation made a collaboration inquiry with this group. So what I wanted to share about here is that some members have expressed concern that by having these separate topic areas, we are perhaps creating more silos. But our intention is that in serving as in a backbone capacity, we're keeping the pulse of all these different groups and conversations and looking for collaboration opportunities. And we're also sharing the report outs from what's happening in these groups with one another. So then we see one group, maternity care practices, recognized that one of the things they would like to work on has a lot in common with some of the things that could use the support of the nurse education and training group. And so they have made a proposal together. So there's cross-pollination is very possible and I think very desirable as these move forward too. Okay, next, paid leave. So the steward here is Moms Rising, and there's 3 priority strategies they've identified. The first is to increase the ability of community leaders to speak coherently and meaningfully about the intersection of paid leave and breastfeeding. And isn't it satisfying to see that happening in our society, I gotta say. Strategy 2 is to enhance the work of partners leading on paid leave by better integrating breastfeeding into the national dialogue. And strategy 3, to build the evidence of support for paid leave legislation. So, fun fact here, in the beginning, when a lot of constellations are just starting out, USBC staff have played a larger role in supporting the process and some administrative support and helping the groups to get going, especially before there's a volunteer facilitator. So in the beginning, Cheryl Lebedovich, who serves on USBC as the Workplace Project Manager, helped to facilitate this topic's incubation. But now that it's launched to a non-USBC steward with Moms Rising in the lead, Cheryl can stay due to the fact that there's an alignment between what the paid leave group is doing and her work portfolio over in workplace support. But she's there, in this case, as a participant and to support the cross-pollination of the 2 constellations. And I wanted to lift that up to show, there's fluidity all over the place, including what kind of roles USBC staff may play in any of these where they're sitting at the table. And then finally, workplace support. The steward here is Cheryl Lebedovich, and there's 2 priority strategies. The first is to increase the understanding of employer responsibilities and employer rights under federal and state law through an education campaign emphasizing existing implementation resources. And the second is to identify the gaps in the current laws and work to expand protection for all employees. So the fun fact here is that media and legal partners have been invited to the conversation, and they'll have an option to join the constellation. And that's really one of the beautiful components, too, I think, of the constellation model is that, if we have a partner out in the world that we think could benefit from working with the people at the table or could significantly, add to that conversation where it's mutually beneficial, we can invite them in to that conversation and or to formally join the constellation. So, for example, the Department of Labor is now sitting at that table. Department of Labor is not likely to become a USBC member at large or to attend other constellations, perhaps paid leave, who knows, but but they're not going to be as inclined perhaps to go to, formula marketing. But in the constellation model, they'd have the option to join just this constellation because that makes sense for them. So that, again, the fluidity and access is a very nice piece. And part of what we're going to talk about as we build on this webinar, of course, is also further ways for coalitions to also be part of these conversations. So I'm going to go on mute and drink some water. 1 second. Okay, didn't think you need to hear that. So Constellation next steps for the next category of groups. These are emerging, organizing, and, so the groups that we just talked about, excuse me, their next steps are to move the collaborative work forward through Constellation workspaces and virtual meetings. So all of the constellations that have identified their priority strategies are in stage 2 and beyond, now have Constellation workspaces, and they're moving forward having virtual meetings. They meet at the discretion of the steward, depending on what's going on for that group. And then the stewards are invited to what we're calling a steward roundtable, so that they can be working together with us while we all figure out how to do this. Because this kind of collaborative work is different and new for, I think, just about everyone. And they have all been asked in a new and stronger way to deeply consider the role of the coalitions in their emerging work. So we've seen that 5 of these topics specifically recognize that to be successful, they're going to also need to host and support and interact with coalition communities of practice. But we also recognize that all of the constellations can benefit from having coalition representatives at that table. And so we're now in the process of working through how to bring you all in and integrate that. So next we're going to talk about the remaining 6 constellations that are either learning communities or incubation conversations. So the indicators for these topics are those that they have a good mix of stakeholders at the table perhaps, but they probably recognize they still need to do some outreach in order to reach their equity goals and have a truly representational mix of people to start the conversation. They may have engaged in an incubation conversation about high-level levers for change, but perhaps they recognize that they need to have further consideration of the timing, momentum, and capacity before they can do their final prioritization. And again, as I mentioned earlier, they need to make sure that what they're identifying for the collaborative action really is something that needs the collective lift of organizations coming together. If it's individuals coming together, even very passionate individuals coming together, then that is appropriate for a learning community. We can be talking with each other, sharing materials, networking, but it's different than taking on collaborative cross-sector change. So they may have identified a lead organization to serve as the steward, but right now these are groups that are currently facilitated by pairs of a volunteer mixed with a USBC staff person for support. So in our Constellation Formation Pathway, then we're talking about organizations that are here on the chart. And I put these big arrows on to really ground the part of the organic nature of this model is that when these collaborative groups come together and they have an incubation conversation, they might find that all the right components are there, like the will to formalize. If so, like I shared about the Community-Based Organization group, they decided they had what it was going to take, the will, the interest, and the clear priorities to go ahead and formalize, and that brought them into stage 2. Then there are other times where there are groups that determine that what's appropriate for them is to remain a learning community. Now, this is not something that's then set in stone forevermore, because what we anticipate is that if from the learning communities where these passionate individuals are sharing information and networking with each other, they're going to surface opportunities for collaborative action. And when that happens, they can request our support or otherwise organize to have an incubation conversation and see if the time is right. They have the momentum, here's the capacity, the collaborative thing that needs all of us to do the collective lift. If so, then they can formalize. So there's kind of, you know, a cycle that happens over here. And there's no shame in the game. In fact, we encourage groups to go be a learning community if they're not able to get out of this stage and come here, because otherwise they're just recycling the same conversation. And I think we've all been to meetings like that, and just we need to limit that in our lives. So, okay, the next topic is continuity of care. So this is a topic that has not had a steward for a little while, so it's been one in search of a steward. And Healthy Children Project has just stepped forward and formally agreed to serve as the incubation facilitator. So some of the incubation ideas, now remember, this is idea land, right? This is not the priority strategies that have been chosen. These are still just topics of conversation. So some of their lead ideas are to scan the landscape and conduct a gap analysis to inform the creation of a toolkit. Another is to map the connections with health IT. We all know there's a lot changing in that realm. And the third is to scan for significant landscape updates for incorporation of breastfeeding into broader cross-sector collaboration opportunities. Now that we have a steward, I expect that this is going to be a topic that gains a lot of momentum fairly quickly. And I would also anticipate that this is a topic where we will see a sixth community of practice emerge. But that's for those participants to decide. Next is donor milk. This has had incubation co-facilitators of Himbana and the Breastfeeding Coalition of Oregon. There are many ideas.
Can I jump in for a second? Yes. So for some of these acronyms, even Himbana, we'll go back and expand all the acronyms that have been said so far, but we are getting questions saying we don't know what CGBI is or what ABI is or Avon. So we'll go back and do that, but for any of the following acronyms, if we can expand them, that would be great for the audience.
Noted. Yes, thank you. I will do that. My apologies. So Himbana is, and hopefully you and Janae can help me if I stumble. So for this one, it's Human Milk Banking Association of North America and the Breastfeeding Coalition of Oregon. So as you can see here, there are many different ideas on the table. This is a giant topic. So I'm just going to lift up a few. One is advocating for federal research regarding the safety, impact, and cost. One is to explore the levers to require donor milk in the NICU, the neonatal intensive care unit. Another great idea is to develop a decision-making model for mothers with excess milk to inform a campaign that is inclusive of many options, needs, priorities, and communities. So the fun fact here is that the facilitators of this incubation conversation met with Senator Merkley in January, and he's becoming a champion in this topic area, which is very exciting given his success in being a champion for workplace support topics in the past. So next we have Fathers and Families. The incubation facilitator here has been Best for Babes. And this is a group that has surfaced a couple incubation ideas, but really recognize that in order to develop a campaign highlighting the roles of fathers and grandfathers, and or to build the capacity to be responsive to the media, they were really going to need funding. And in particular, they wanted to recruit a lead organization to serve as steward that is male-centered or male-led or father-focused, or however you want to say, having a lead that is other than Best for Babes. Whoops, let's see. There we go. So at their April meeting, this group decided to remain a learning community from now. And as I said a moment ago, they can now engage in conversation, recruit more stakeholders and voices, find some of those father-centered organizations, and if the time arises and they want to have an incubation conversation and check out formalizing, then they can do that. This next one is other health professional education and training. The incubation facilitator here has been ASPHN, so the Association of State Public Health Nutritionists, I believe. You can correct me if that's wrong. So some of the incubation ideas on their table included really prioritizing what other professions, and by this we meant they're not nurses and they're not doctors and they're not necessarily just lactation support providers. So you know, they had thought to start with registered dietitians, physician assistants, pharmacists, and social workers. That's kind of where they wanted to start. And to look at the inclusion of breastfeeding questions on their exams, and to advocate for the inclusion of breastfeeding core competencies in the training materials, education materials for those professions. But again, this is a group that at their April meeting, they decided to remain a learning community for now. So they can, you know, continue to find these types of professionals to come and help change their profession using the USBC Core Competency Guide or other tools that we have. Okay, next is physician education and training. This is a group that we anticipate is probably going to select their priority strategies soon and move along the pathway. They have not had their spring incubation session yet. Some of the ideas that are on the table here include to advocate for hands-on training supporting breastfeeding and clinical physical skills testing, to advocate for the inclusion of questions on the AMSA exit interview, and to create and promote self-directed curriculum and online modules for continuing education. So some of the fun facts that I wanted to lift up for you here is that in addition to scanning, you know, what I called keeping the pulse of all these constellations and looking for, you know, ways that we can join them and help them work together and not build more silos, but work together. It's all about working together. We also are looking for where have organizations stated that they have interest. And for USBC national members at this time, that's through their engagement level surveys. And then we have done very specific targeted outreach to make sure that wherever they said they were interested, they actually have a representative coming and sitting at these tables to participate in the incubation conversations. And then also of note, we had a meeting where we brought the physicians and the nurses and the other health professional education and training groups all together so that they had a time to be in one room working together. And the physician group really wanted to make note that they thought it was very fruitful that they had the time to do that. So we are responsive to those requests and look for those opportunities so that you know, groups feel like they're able to interact. Next, we have the research coordination and translation incubation conversation, and this is another one that we expect to move forward very soon. Kenny, I'm hoping you can help me with AAN. I think it's the American Academy of Nurses. Can maybe put that in the chat. The incubation ideas here are to identify the top research needs and developments in the landscape since the Surgeon General's call to action. We know that a lot has changed in the last 5 years, and that certainly is true in the realm of research, especially if you look through the implementation ideas behind each of the action steps. There's a lot of different calls for research, and that could really stand to be updated. Excuse me. They need to do a scan of research funders, and then in particular differentiate the niche for a USBC affiliated constellation, which we think would probably really focus on advocacy efforts, versus the Federal Research Consortium that the call to action called for, that we suspect will probably focus on increasing the evidence base. So there are kind of two different actions here, but because the Federal Research Consortium has not yet been convened, all these long 5 years, we need to really take further action to differentiate what the role is of a constellation that, convened by USBC. So the good news is that the next time this group meets, we will have the key federal partners on the call to clarify the status of the Federal Research Consortium so that we can just get that clear. Okay, so next steps for this cluster of topics is that they will continue to have their virtual incubation sessions across the summer. As those topics choose their priority strategies and identify stewards, then they'll move along the pathway, the little chart that we've been looking at. And once they have their priorities, then they also receive their constellation workspaces. So the topics that remain as learning communities for now, again, if a need arises in the future, they can request our support to reconvene an incubation conversation, and that's part of what we're here to do. So this is kind of a fun chart for me. This is maybe the 5th one of these, so we've been able to kind of have a time-based snapshot of how they're moving forward. And I can tell you that this chart at this moment that I updated just this morning is different than the chart that I made only 2 months ago, because these groups are evolving along the pathway. And eventually we will have additional topics. These are just the 14 that we started with, but we are quite confident there's a lot more to do, and as capacity builds, and especially as coalitions come into this and help us build, we'll have additional topics, and we can just keep on tracking everyone's progress. So before we get into the next section, that's really about how coalitions then can come into this structure, this evolving structure, I wanted to pause and ask if there are any questions that you have about these updates, the topics so far. Ginny, do we have any questions?
Whoops, I'm sorry. I didn't realize I was muted in two places. So, yeah, we do have a question. One is, could you just briefly describe what root cause analysis is? The idea of having each of these constellations really look at their work through the lens of equity is so crucial. And what does root cause analysis involve?
Oh, it's a good big question. And Kinkini, you're welcome to help me find my way through an answer. So, I think that there are several different ways that these can be constructed. The tool that we are currently using in these constellations is something that we adapted from the Center for Social Inclusion, and a root cause analysis tool that they gave us that went along with an article that we asked members to read. The main point is to lead organizations through a process where they look at what are the institutions and the history and the people and the agencies that all have a role in impacting this particular topic. And is there anything within that through the history or the current structures have embedded racial inequities? And we surface that then to ask, what then do we need to do to address the way that this is having a disproportionate impact on some populations of people? I could say more about that. Do you have anything you would add to that, Kinkini?
Yeah, you said it like really succinctly, but it is about, who is most impacted, or when we take a decision, who benefits the most, who's most impacted negatively by it. So there are set of questions that you ask when you make these policy decisions. So yeah, we'd be happy to share that. Actually, I'm looking for it. If there is like a place that we have a single document, I'll list it on as a resource as well, so you can see how, what kind of questions are asked.
Yes, that we definitely can share that, and I would think CSI's a source article about it as well. And it could even be a great topic for a racial equity webinar at some point. One of the things that's important to us is, it's not like you one and done. You do it one time and then you're good. It's really a nice tool for creating that lens, or those lenses that we talked about, so that groups can be very intentional to make sure that they're thoughtful about what the current status of life is for many different people based on this topic or the constraints or institutions around it. And then, as Kinkini said, whatever's being proposed, would it have, can we anticipate that it might have an unintended consequence or touch different people in different ways? And like I gave the example of the nurse education and training, doing that process changes your priorities, because suddenly you're like, oh, this is actually, if we want to really change breastfeeding rates, we need to support the people who are directly supporting those who are disproportionately impacted by having limited access to care. So let's change that. That's where we want to start. And and the thing that's exciting is, like, when you hit it and it's the right thing and it has the most meaning, like, wow, there's your momentum. And all of a sudden, here's two organizations, we've got skin in the game, we want to lead this, we're going to do it, it is important, it's going to make a difference, and you go. And truly, until we brought that tool to that particular group, they were very much in a cycle of recirculating the same conversation. So yeah, hopefully that's helpful. Do a time check here. Oh, we're in good shape. Okay, so this next section is about coalition engagement opportunities. And I'll be very straightforward with all of you and say, just like we've been in a big process of kind of channeling and learning and reiterative creation here around what it is to do collaborative work in constellations, we're similarly going to be in a process with you all of figuring out how we bring coalitions and integrate into all of this. So this is the beginning of articulating that. So hopefully this first part of what I'm going to describe to you again is a repeat. Some of these are very same slides that have been in earlier webinars. Not to say you'd have to be in all of them, but hopefully through working with Kinkini and Danae, you all are familiar with some of these important stepping stones. So first, to build out individual profiles on the USBC website, join the learning communities that you're interested in, looking for the topic areas that are of interest to your coalition, and then build out your coalition's group profile in the USBC website. So again, what's in the individual profiles? Hopefully you all have one, but it includes your contact information, your coalition affiliations, your bio, the areas of expertise, and your demographics. And at the bottom, it also shows you which communities you belong to. So that can also be a helpful, quick reference when you're trying to find your way through the website. You can have some quick links down there you can access. So then the learning communities, we have more than 20 online learning communities on breastfeeding related topics. So across the top banner of the website, you see the different topic areas. And when you select one of those and go into, let's say, fathers and families, within the information about fathers and families and the action directory showing you other organizations that are active in that area, you can also see where you can join the learning community. Those are open to all site users. So if you have an individual or group profile, you can get an individual profile, you can get into the learning communities. It's a place to connect with others, share information and resources, and surface opportunities for collaborative action. So to this point that I've been making of looking for the chances where you could have an incubation conversation that's really going to arise from the learning communities. And you can see there's a lot more learning communities than there are constellations. So those will continue to form. What's in the group profiles? The organizational contact information, especially the website link where they exist. The membership demographics. So I hope you all know USBC's equity priority, and one of our commitments is to track the demographics of member organizations and coalitions, as well as the individuals having profiles on the site. You also want to pay special attention to the engagement levels. This is where you define your coalition's level of interest in the topic areas. So core, supportive, peripheral, or core, involved, peripheral, or supportive. And the definitions are all embedded in the website, so you can see it right there. But you're basically letting us know if it's a core level of interest, this is something where you have capacity, you have expertise, you have will, it's really important to you. You could even potentially lead on it. If you indicate that you're involved, it means this is something highly important, an active area, you would be interested in participating, but certainly want to be kept apprised of what's going on. If it's supportive, I think is the next level down, it's, again, you would probably sign on to a letter, but you wouldn't necessarily make time to show up for a meeting. It matters for you, you're supportive of it, but it's not a major area of work. And if you're peripheral, it just means go forth and do good work, but not an area where your coalition is going to give a heavy lift. So the engagement levels are incredibly important for your group to pay attention to, and we'll talk about why in a moment. And then the activity descriptions. This is what populates the call to action directory. So remember a moment ago when we talked about accessing the learning communities? You want to make note wherever your coalition is active in one of the Surgeon General's action areas, you want to make note of that. One of the exciting reasons why to do that is that heading towards National Breastfeeding Month in August, we would like to pull from the directory and present a report to the Surgeon General's office saying, look, you're 5 years into your 10-year plan, and here midway through, look what we've done. It's so awesome. This is what we've all done together, and present that as a summary report of what's happened in the field. So populating your coalition's actions on the action directory then contributes to that larger body of work across the summer. So I really had emphasized the engagement levels. So why is that such a big deal? Well, first, because that data that you provide feeds into the needs assessment updates, and the data will also be used to target opportunities to specific coalitions. So whether for action, collaboration, example programs, or speakers. So if we know this is something that you care about, your core or involved, we will make sure you're getting news items about that, that you have the opportunities to participate, that we don't want to inundate you with everything in the world. Nobody likes that. You just start to tune out. So if you let us know what you care about, we'll make sure that we're targeting you with the information that matters. And then also the data will be used to target communication and information to your coalition on the specific topic areas. So if we know that you care a lot about continuity of care, as that group progresses, we'll make sure that you get information about what's happening there. I'm going to pause for a second. Okay, excuse me. So then participation in these constellations, these exciting things you've just been hearing about. So as you are doing your part to fill out the engagement levels and your group profiles, your leader update surveys, and the action directories, like you give us all of that, and in exchange, then the Constellation stewards will review that information to identify a representative sample of coalitions to join in the national constellation conversations on all of these topics. So if you have a coalition that's very interested in any of the topics we just talked about, telling us who you are and what you care about is the way that we learn about you and the stewards learn about you to help make and foster those connections. So obviously we can't have, obviously and unfortunately, we can't have every interested coalition be at every constellation table. It's going to need to be, we're going to have to load balance the thing a little bit. So again, this representative sample of coalitions, so that the groups, stay nimble and manageable and can, get good work done. But our coalition staff, Danae and Kinkini, are going to support this process to ensure that there's a balance of engagement between and across the states, and that throughout the process we're applying an equity lens. So hopefully that's more exciting than frustrating. It's going to be one of those things we're all going to have to kind of work out and learn about as we move forward. But I'm very excited to see coalitions be integrated into these, to the current 14 topics, and then also to, topics that emerge in the future. And then finally, I wanted to lift up one more time that I gave several references at the top to topics where we know we will be developing communities of practice starting in the fall. So again, those topics are going to include formula marketing, infant sleep practices, lactation support providers, maternity care practices, and workplace support. So we will be integrating the sign-up process for coalitions that want to be part of any of these communities of practice. And these will be much more open to coalitions, where the constellation process will be more steward-led and kind of curated. Excuse me, for the representational sample, this will be much more following a process of looking at your interest and bringing you in together so that you can have online communities of practice. So the name of the game this whole way through is that we are better together. And these pictures of all these lovely ladies are from the lactation support provider Constellation meeting that happened in person in November. And this is a group that needed to move very slow, what Stephen Covey calls moving at the speed of trust, in order to really come through some of the harder times of their past and build a shared understanding of a declaration of intent to work collaboratively together and through an equity lens and in a way that honors all providers. And look, it can be done. Over time, you can build the relationships, and you can even be fun and silly together. So there's hope for all of us. So with that, I'd like to open it up for questions.
Thanks so much, Amelia. And we do have a lot of comments and lots of interest about, how coalitions can engage. So as Amelia said, do fill out your group profiles, fill out the engagement level so people can find you and know what your coalitions are doing. But we have a comment from Suzanne Haydu, who's an active member of the Other Health Professionals Constellation, and she says that one of the reasons why it's been in a learning community is that some of the key stakeholders have not been part of this discussion, and they have the Accreditation Council for Education in Nutrition and Dietetics will be joining this constellation as well. So RDs, I know there are a lot of dietitians on this call, we heard about that. So if you can join the learning community, get it, get the discussions up, that would be great. So some of the other comments were, what is some of the timeline for the engagement for what does it involve to be part of a constellation? How often do they meet? How what is the investment of a coalition?
That's a great question. I think that's going to vary hugely. Um, I think there will be some that maybe meet, only quarterly on a virtual basis so that they can, have a touchstone and move things forward. Then there's going to be other groups that will be extremely active. We have one group right now that has now launched 5 different subgroups. And so that have their own meeting schedules. So it's really going to be specific to whatever's going on. But I think the other side of that is it would be you would get to say what is doable for you and what your interest is, both in terms of how you express your engagement level, but once there, I think there'd be an opportunity, I would think, to really talk about what kind of capacity and interest, including time, your coalition would be able to make in that topic.
Great. Thank you. And then we have a couple of questions about how, kind of trying to see that even with these constellations, to make sure that the community voices are being heard by these multi-sectoral constellations. So how can we incorporate community health workers into the other health professionals or some of these? And absolutely, I think that, again, it's the join the learning community, build, have the conversations. And anything else you'd like to add about how to have community voices infused throughout some of these constellations as well?
I think that the main way that you would get found and known is, participating in the learning communities and in the communities of practice, as Kinkini said. Those are going to be the mechanisms for expressing your interest. You can know that from our side, that's very much part of the equity lens and the equity mirror is, and I think that both the crash committee, that is our equity committee internally, and the community-based organization Constellation, between those two, I think we've got some really nice bridge opportunities for, being able to lift up community voices and find those ways to connect across constellations and across organizations. Is what I suspect will happen.
Agreed, yes. And the other question was, how do we join the learning community? And here's what you can do. Like when you go to our website at www.usbreastfeeding.org, if you go to the second tab, which is News and Info, just click on that second tab, scroll down, and it says Learning Communities, and click on that. It'll open up all the different learning communities that are open right now. So we have more than 20 at this point in time. So that way you can join the ones that are of interest to you and your coalition. Looks like those are all the questions we have. Comments about great webinar, looking forward to having coalitions be part of it. And then also we'll post, the questions that we had about some of the root cause analysis questions that you asked, what problem are we trying to solve? Who's most marginalized by the problem, and where are they? Who's doing well despite the problem, and where are they? These are the kind of questions that are being asked by these groups. What are the policies that are impacting the problem, either positively or negatively? Who are the institutions that are impacting the problem positively or negatively? So we'll put some of the other ancillary resources along as well, right, Amelia? We can do those in a couple days.
Yes.
All right. So I think, will the constellations or learning communities be flagged for the Surgeon General's call to action? Yes, absolutely. And Amelia, you can speak to that.
Yes. Yes, the action directory in particular will be part of the report that we give to the Surgeon General. I think one of the ideas we've had, and you know, our hands are a little full, so this is just an idea, but what we would like to do, if we can manage it, is to also ask the constellations to engage in a process looking if there is anything about the action or the implementation plan, the way it's written, that needs to be updated. So, you know, in this ultimate version of the ultimate vision, as my mother would call it, we are not just making a report out of what has happened, but also providing recommendations about what's changed significantly enough in the last 5 years that it could be worthwhile to do a supplement or an update to the call to action. So that's one thing that comes to mind from your question. I think the other thing to know is that we're going to be changing the format of the national member meetings so that they will be one day rather than two, and the general sessions and opening sessions will be live web broadcast, so that, you know, we're really opening this up. And the constellations, so in the past, we would have, like distant past, USBC would have a time where the national member organizations would all give updates. Then the organization grew, was far too big to be able to do that and still have productive parts of the meeting in just 2 days' time. So the latest idea is that the constellations would have a time of giving their top-level report outs, so that it's another opportunity where the constellations are cross-pollinating and sharing with the field what's happening inside of these collaborative groups. So I answered a few more questions than you asked, but hopefully what also comes through is that, you know, there's very much a creative, generative process here where this is all emergent. So we're playing and working and adjusting as we go to see what the opportunities are. But the core intention is, you know, an open organization, one of inclusion and transparency, one with many opportunities, but also with all of that, having communication pathways that don't overwhelm people. So you really are, while you're connecting into the channels of information and the specific things that you need in order to thrive and to give and to receive the best.
Great. Thank you, Amelia. And there are a lot of questions about the USBC strategic framework, and if folks can get that. And I just wanted to make a plug and say that, as Amelia mentioned, one of the day-long pre-conference sessions in the August National Breastfeeding Conference will be on the lactation support providers. We will have another pre-conference on strategic planning and partnerships coalition style. So this will really walk us through how USBC did its whole framework of engaging the different stakeholders, coming up with our priorities in a way that really decentralizes some of the power and makes it, you know, gets ownership from various stakeholders. And so we'll be doing an in-depth session on that as well. But in the meanwhile, Danae and I are here to help any of you with questions about, you know, our strategic plan and how we might help you with that as well. So I think that kind of ends all the questions that we've covered. So thank you all so much for being here, and thank you, Amelia. This is so exciting for us, and you will see that the communications in the coming months and weeks, as well as the conference, will be really a great place and a venue for coalitions to network, to engage, and to find ways in which to work on state and national level initiatives. So thank you for all you do to improve the lives of women, children, and families. Before we close, I also want to remind you that next Tuesday on May 24th, we will be bringing you the next webinar on our racial equity webinar series. And this one is titled Societal Equity, a fresh look at creating effective strategies. This is on Tuesday, May 24th from 11 to 12:30 Eastern. And I hope you'll join us for it. So goodbye for now. And I look forward to have you all for our next Power Tools webinar session. Thank you.
Thank you.